Hi, everyone. Welcome to Empowering Minds Namibia podcast. Today, I'm your host, Kali Imwaka, inviting you to our third episode as the Empowering Minds Namibia podcast. Today, we are going to tackle on a topic that says the battle that you are unaware of. What happens in your brain, or what happens mentally when you are unaware of what is happening? Today, I'm joined by Colin and Michaela. I would like to give them a platform to introduce themselves, give us a little bit of their background. So, by that, I'm going to start with Michaela to introduce herself and give us a little bit of a background and what she's currently doing now.
Hello, as Adam mentioned, my name is Michaela. I'm from the US, from Boston, and I'm currently serving as a Peace Corps volunteer. I'm working in community health. I'm specifically stationed with Tonata, which is an Namibian NGO, and we basically organize a network for people living with HIV. I also have experience working in psychology labs as a teacher, and I hold a bachelor in neuroscience as well as a minor in global public health.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. So, we have heard from Michaela, and right now, we're going to hear from Colin.
Morning, everybody. My name's Colin.
Hello.
I am originally from North Carolina in the United States. I was also a Peace Corps volunteer in Namibia from 2022 to 2024, working at the Multipurpose Center in Ongwediva. I'm now back in the States working for Peace Corps in the United States, and I hold a bachelor's in biology and a minor in neuroscience.
Oh, thank you. So that really tells us that today we are going to dive deep into the brain. So on mental health, we are going to find out what is mental health. A lot of people out there, the youth, are unaware of what mental health is, and they would really want to know what mental health is really. So with that, I'm going to start with Michaela to give us what mental health is from her side.
Yeah, so I think that's a great starting point for our discussion today. Essentially, mental health is a person's state of mind, their feelings, and their emotions. And this is such an important topic because a person's mental health is what underpins their decision making and their ability to build relationships. For example, you can wake up in the morning feeling maybe frustrated or irritated, and that might dictate how you go about the day, versus you might wake up in the morning feeling more joyful, confident, might reach out to your friend to hang out. And as you can see, it kind of just is your dictates how you're moving forward. So I've heard a lot of misconceptions about mental health. One being that mental health has to mean poor mental health. But the thing is that mental health is a spectrum. There's positive mental health, there's negative mental health, and there's all that's in between. First, let's talk about what is positive mental health. And we like to call this mental well being. And this basically is a state that enables people to cope with stresses in life, realize their potential, allows them to work well and learn well and contribute to the community overall. But mental health is not a constant state. Just because you have good mental health one day doesn't mean it's going to be the same the next day. So I think it's important to think of mental health as a weather system. For example, some days are sunny, some days are stormy, basically highlighting the fact that mental health is going to fluctuate from one day to the next, from one week to the next. And this just means that you have to have adjustments and plan ahead. This means that you want to have coping mechanisms for when your mental health isn't the best. You want to have your umbrella or your raincoat for those days that you maybe wake up feeling frustrated, like I said. And next, like I was talking about before, mental health does not mean mental health conditions. This is something separate. Mental health conditions are diagnosable issues, and these are things that disrupt a person's functioning. So this is what affects their thinking, their mood, and behavior. And this is something that has to be diagnosed by a mental health professional. It's also important to note that having good mental health doesn't mean that you can't not have an existing diagnoses. You can have a mental health diagnosis and still have good mental health. In fact, that's the aim for everyone. So you might be diagnosed with something like anxiety disorder, but the goal moving forward is that you're going to have good mental health. So that does not mean that being diagnosed with a mental health condition is going to mean that you're only going to have poor mental health moving forward.
Thank you so much. That was very informative. And I really think we are going to get into detail from this. And from now, we are going to hear from Colin's side on what mental health is. Colin.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Michaela covered most of it, but I think it's just important to reiterate when we're thinking about mental health that it's constantly changing. Your mental well-being is constantly changing. Same way your overall health is constantly changing. Just because you're feeling good one day doesn't mean it can't get, you might not feel as good the next day. That's okay. And you're just constantly working at it. And also understanding that so many different factors play a role in mental health. And then, if you have a mental health condition like anxiety or depression, that might be genetic, that might be certain things in your life that play a factor in that. And just understanding that there are a lot of resources out there to ensure that everybody is working towards a positive mental health.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that. We really think we have gotten the mental health, what mental health is. So, for our listeners who may be unfamiliar, can you give us a crash course in relevant biology that we can use for our understanding moving forward?
Yeah. So we're going to cover a few things today. So we're going to try to give a little bit of background and just terminology, different things we're going to be talking about so our listeners can understand it. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today is the brain, the spinal cord, which is called the central nervous system. And therefore, we're going to be talking about neurons or nerve cells. Again, humans are made up of all different types of cells, your skin cells, any type of cell. We're going to focus a lot today on your neurons, which are located in your spinal cord, your brain, and throughout the body. And best way to think about how a nerve cell looks, it's basically you have a big cell body and then you have a long strip called the axon that passes along a message. And then at the end, you have an axon terminal, which basically is just like little branches branching out everywhere. So you'll have a signal come, it will go to and then it'll pass down the axon and then be released to the next neuron through the axon terminal. And then a few other things we're going to talk about today are neurotransmitters. These are the chemicals that allow messages to be passed from one neuron to the next. So they'll go from the axon terminal, and then a chemical will be released, and it'll go to the next axon or the next nerve cell. It's important to note that we're also going to talk about when it leaves this one neuron and goes to the next, there's a little space right here, an empty space. It's going to be called the synaptic cleft. And so a chemical, a neurotransmitter will be released from one. It's like a little ball, and it'll go to the next one through this synaptic cleft. So, that's a lot we're going to talk about today. I think a fun way to think about it is you can think about a tree, maybe, and the trunk of the tree is the axon, and then the message goes up from the trunk of the tree, and then it goes to the branches, which is the axon terminal. And then let's say seeds are the thing that's being released from that tree. Those seeds are like the neurotransmitters, and they're sending a message to another tree. It's just a simple way to think about it. And then we're going to talk a little bit about also hormones. So, hormones are also chemicals that send messages throughout the body. The big difference is a hormone is made in a certain part of the body called the endocrine system, and it's released throughout the bloodstream. Where when we're thinking about neurotransmitters, we're thinking about messages between nerve cells. So, hormones everywhere in the bloodstream, neurotransmitters between neurons. Something can be both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. So I think we're going to cover mainly four different neurotransmitters or hormones today. One of those being dopamine. Dopamine is huge. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter or hormone that is regarded as the reward system. So it gives you this feeling of pleasure. If you eat something you like, then dopamine is released, and your body's like, wow, I really like that. That tasted really good. Or if you do well, if you study and then get a really good grade on your test, then you can get a little bit of dopamine released, and you're like, wow, that was great. I want to do that again. There's both positives and negatives to that we'll get into a bit about today. Then we'll think about serotonin, which is another one. And this is thought about like the feel good chemical. So this regulates your mood. This is more a state of feeling at peace as opposed to dopamine, which is more a reward system. So we'll talk about serotonin as well, but they both play a crucial role in all of this. And we'll talk a little bit about endorphins, which can be released, and these are also kind of like your body's painkillers, basically, or again, they make your body feel good when they are released. And then finally, we're going to talk about the hormone cortisol, which is known as your stress hormone. Cortisol is also important just in anything. It's released when you do have stress. If a bear or if a lion attacks you, your body is going to release cortisol to alert your body that I need to move out of the way from the lion. So it, causes a lot of different reactions in your body, but cortisol is also released throughout the day normally. Right before you wake up, there will be a release of cortisol to wake your body up, saying this is the time that I wake up normally. I need to get out of bed, and cortisol is released to alert your body to get moving. But it's also can if it's too much cortisol all the time, then we'll get into that today and how that plays a role in stress. So those are the main ones that we're going to talk about today. And then Michaela, I think we'll talk about a little bit more.
Sorry. Yeah, just following up on the context that Colin just set down there. It's important to think of how these neurotransmitters and hormones work in systems. So something that Colin kind of touched on at the beginning was the central nervous system. So basically we have the nervous system, which is broken into two components. We have the central nervous system and we have the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is just the brain and the spinal cord, and it basically controls and coordinates the body's functions. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, and this is basically everything else. So it's all the nerves connecting the central nervous system to the rest of the body. And this just relays sensory information to the central nervous system, and then the central nervous system processes that information and creates a response. So for example, you might put your hand on a hot surface, maybe an oven, and there's going to be nerves in your skin that pick up on that signal, and then that signal is relayed by the PNS to the central nervous system. And then in the central nervous system, your brain then identifies this is hot, this is a threat, this is danger. And then it's going to send a signal down to your rest of your body, basically saying, we need to move. So then your peripheral nervous system is going to send a signal to your muscles, which then cause your muscles to contract, and then you end up moving away your hand. So you can see it kind of acts in kind of a feedback loop where information is going to your brain, and then your brain's creating a response for then your body to follow out. And then next, we have to talk about how the peripheral nervous system is broken into two different systems. So we have the parasympathetic nervous system, and this is known as your rest and digest system. This is active when you're in a state that is calm. So your body's ramping down all of its processes. Basically, your foot is on the brake. Things are moving slowly. There's no real threats. And then we have the sympathetic nervous system, and this is known as your fight or flight system. And basically, it's active in situations of high stress and danger. You can think of it as your foot is on the gas pedal. Your systems are ramping up to respond to the threat. As Colin mentioned, you're going to have all this cortisol flowing through your body. So your body is basically gearing up for some sort of intense action. And then next, let's talk about a little bit about the brain and brain structures. Basically, today we're going to talk about two different main areas. We have the cortical and we have the subcortical. The cortical is known as the cerebral cortex, and this is the outer layer of the brain. It's responsible for higher level processing like reasoning and decision making. And then we have the subcortical, and this is all the different structures below the outer layer, which is the cortex, as I mentioned. And this basically manages basic autonomic functions. So these are functions that are involuntary. And they also process things like emotions and motor coordinations. And there's basically a continuous feedback loop between the cortex and the subcortical structures. We have this kind of top-down processing where your cortex is guiding what's going on in the subcortical zones. And then we have this bottom-up processing where the subcortical structures are sending information to the cortex for further processing.
Hey, thank you so much for that. Indeed, this is a really hidden battle that happens in our heads when we are mentally unwell. So we have heard that central nervous system plays a role in this, and all the neurons also have to play a role in this, in mental health. And also we have different brain structures that gives us different thinking capacities, if I heard that very well. And also moving on, I would like to ask Michaela, we'll start. What are some of examples, mental health disorders, and what happens in the brain and body during these disturbances?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think a good place to start is talking about anxiety disorder. So before we get into what is anxiety disorder, I think it's important to talk about how anxiety is a normal part of life. So you might have a test coming up and you're feeling anxious, or you might have a big sports tournament and you're feeling anxious. That sort of anxiety is a normal part of life. It's going to come and go, and that's okay. But then when things become classified as anxiety disorder is when a person has frequent, intense, excessive, and persistent worry and fear about everyday situations. So that means that the situation that a person is dealing with is not warranting so much fear and anxiety. You might have anxiety about school in general. It's not just anxiety about taking an exam, it's anxiety about just even going to school. And that's something that a person is not able to control. So you have all these anxious thoughts. And with someone who does not have anxiety disorder, they might be able to calm themselves down, tell themselves, this isn't something that's a threat. I don't need to be anxious. Versus someone who has anxiety disorder, they're not able to control their thoughts or their anxiety. So the causes of anxiety disorder are not fully understood. It could be a little bit of life experiences, or there could be some sort of genetic predisposition. But either way, it's an important thing that you want to look out for so then you can seek the help you need. And we can break this down in different ways to try to understand anxiety. From a neurological perspective, we want to focus on the amygdala. So the amygdala is a subcortical structure, and it's basically the brain's emotional center. That's what you want to think about it as. And it's responsible for processing fear. However, when a person has anxiety disorder, the amygdala becomes hyperactive. So as Colin mentioned, we have all these neurotransmitters that are going through the brain. And with anxiety disorder, there might be a neurotransmitter imbalance. So specifically, we have two different neurotransmitters going on. We have GABA, which is a calming neurotransmitter, and then we have glutamate, which is excitatory. So this basically means that glutamate is stimulating neurons for activity to happen. And what we see with anxiety disorder is that a person might have high levels of glutamate. So then this means that there's a lot of activity going on in their amygdala, as we mentioned, the hyperactive element. And then this can lead to an exaggerated fear response, or even a fear response when there's no cause. So it's because there's this imbalance of neurotransmitters going on in the amygdala. And then the second element that we want to think about is the prefrontal cortex. And this is involved in that cortical layer, as I was mentioning earlier. And it's responsible for more rational thinking. However, what happens with anxiety disorder is that the prefrontal cortex kind of struggles to regulate this response and manage the worry and fear. So you have all these fear signals coming from the amygdala, and normally the prefrontal cortex is able to kind of regulate that fear and say, oh, this is not something that I actually need to be worried about. Versus with anxiety disorder, you have those fear signals going to the prefrontal cortex, and it's taking it as an actual threat and not able to kind of regulate those down as it would normally. So we kind of have this interplay going on between the subcortical and the cortical. But what ends up happening is that this activity leads to the body's fight or flight response. So if you can recall what I was mentioning earlier, this is the sympathetic nervous system, and it's your body's gearing up for something to happen. So basically, we have the prefrontal cortex signal to the hypothalamus, and this is a subcortical structure. And the hypothalamus releases hormones, as Colin mentioned earlier. So it releases cortisol, it releases adrenaline, and these hormones are released into the body, and a physical response is enacted. So we're going to see your increased heart rate, you're going to see alertness, hyperventilation, sweating, trembling, all these different signs that your body is really amped up for some sort of response. And this is also the symptoms that we end up seeing with anxiety disorder. And over time, this can lead to fatigue. It can lead to things like poor concentration, gastrointestinal issues. So just kind of long-term effects overall than just the immediate effects of anxiety. And then one final component that I think it's important to mention is the hippocampus. So this is another subcortical structure. It's involved with memory formation and processing. And what we see with anxiety disorders is that there's a dysfunction of the hippocampus. So this means that it's not able to properly manage its fear emotions. So kind of if you have this maybe fear associated with maybe getting in a car, normally your hippocampus can extinguish that fear and it won't be something that comes up and again. But with anxiety disorder, often the hippocampus, it just functions so that that fear is going to come up again and again every time you go to enter a car. So yeah, those are just some different examples of how anxiety disorder occurs. And later on, we can get into ways of maybe managing that.
Right, thank you. The same question is also posed to Colin.
Yeah, I think when we're thinking about mental conditions, also anxiety is a really important one. And then the other big one is depression. So I'll talk a little bit about that and keep it pretty generalized. But I think it's important to understand that depression is different than sadness. You know, you can feel sad if something happens for a little bit of for a little bit of time, but depression is a very serious mental health condition that really should be taken seriously and people should understand and people should really seek out help and support when dealing with things like this. So it's something that is typically when we think about depression, we're going to think about and talk about two major types, which is major depressive disorder and then persistent depressive disorder. So these things can vary, but when we're thinking about major depressive disorder, we're going to think about symptoms and feelings of depression, which I'll get into, for over a period of 2 weeks. And these are quite extreme and really, you feel the symptoms heavily. It's quite extreme thing to feel. And then persistent depressive disorder, generally, let's think maybe like 2 years. The symptoms might be a little bit less severe, but it's really lasting for a long, long period of time. And it's important to note that if somebody's suffering from major depressive disorder, they can get help. They can work towards s- solving a lot of the issues that might lead to that, and they can feel better for a period of time, but it can be cyclical. So it can, as we said, and Michaela said at the very beginning, it's a constant battle with mental health. So you might feel good right now, and then it can come back as well, and just understanding that. So I think it's important to understand when we're thinking about major depressive disorder, what is that like? What are the symptoms that play a role into that? And a lot of this has to do with you might be just genuine lack of interest in something that you previously enjoyed, something that you liked before, you just get no feeling of interested anymore. And now that doesn't mean that, oh, when I was younger, I really liked football or soccer, and now I don't. It's more just anything that used to make you feel excited or happy throughout the day. You just don't get that anymore. There's a feeling of hopelessness. Also, I think it's important to note that there's a lot of extreme fatigue when you're feeling major depressive disorder. As somebody that's suffered from it before, your brain just feels tired at certain points. You might not sleep very well. You might have a loss of appetite, or you might overeat as well. And we'll get into why that might be the case in a minute. And then as we all know, suicidal thoughts might come up as well. And suicide is a very serious topic in Namibia. It's something that we're really trying to work towards as well and across the globe as well. And so those are a lot of the major symptoms of major depressive disorder. And then when we're thinking about persistent depressive disorder, we're thinking about maybe the symptoms being a little bit less, but lasting for a longer period of time. And when we're thinking about types of depression, it's important to note that these neurotransmitters that we were talking about earlier, you're typically, there's less of them firing in your brain. So serotonin, which we said is the feel good, happy neurotransmitter, there's going to be lower levels of that in your brain. dopamine, there's likely going to be lower levels of that in your brain as well. And this is the feel-good neurotransmitter. So these things that are associated, these chemicals that control every part of your brain, these ones that are denoted with feeling good and reward, there's just less of that. And that is why you might feel more fatigue, you might feel tired, and you might just feel less happy throughout the day. And anxiety and depression can play a role if you're dealing with depression and then are also dealing with anxiety as well. As Michaela said, cortisol is being released when you're dealing with anxiety, and there are a lot of studies that show that when cortisol is being released, it can also downregulate or lower the amount of dopamine and serotonin as well. So they're all really related together, and it's important to note that these are just a lot of times these neurotransmitters that are associated with feeling better, there's just less of in the brain. And I think we're going to get into a little bit later ways to deal with this, understanding how other things you might do in your life might affect it more positively versus more negatively. And I think we'll get into that later on in the podcast.
All right, thank you for that. So, talking about anxiety and depression, these are very sensitive topics. And then we have noticed that these are now rising cases in Namibia. And this will lead us to the next question that says, what are some factors affecting mental health of our high school learners or secondary school learners? Starting with Colin.
Yeah. So I think one that comes up is nicotine. So whether that be through smoking a cigarette or a hookah, a bubbly, or vapes, which are very common nowadays, they can also have a big effect on your brain, especially in adolescence. So as we talked about previously, depression, let's say depression, you might have less dopamine being released in your neurotransmitters being released in your brain. And then when you smoke a cigarette, then you get this instant release of dopamine. Every time you smoke a cigarette, you'll get an instant release of dopamine. And that makes your body feel good. And that's why people become very dependent on it because they know every time I smoke a cigarette or do bubbly and hookah or a vape, then I'll get a small release of dopamine in my brain and that will make me feel better. However, that also leads to withdrawal. If your body's getting this dopamine all the time and then it doesn't, then your body's going to crave that. It's going to want more of that. And this can lead to a lot of really bad things, particularly when you're going through withdrawal. You might have trouble sleeping, trouble concentrating, and then it can also exacerbate or make worse any anxiety and depression as well. And then it's also when we're thinking about adolescence, it's important to understand that as an adolescent, as somebody, your brain is typically not thought to be fully developed till 25. So if you're doing smoking, these effects on your brain are going to slow your development and make it so your brain's not developing the way it should. So when we're thinking about your brain developing and not developing fully till you're 25, we can think about right behind your forehead, your prefrontal cortex is still developing a lot till you're 25. And if you're doing something like nicotine, it's really hindering that ability for your prefrontal cortex to develop. And your prefrontal cortex controls so many things. It controls your decision making, your problem solving, your memory, has a lot to do with your impulse control and understanding, oh, I should not do that. So engaging in these things, particularly when we're talking about adolescence, it's really harming your brain as it's really trying to develop and be the best it possibly can be.
So I think another important topic that we're seeing an issue in Namibia and just around the world in general is alcohol use and alcohol misuse. So today I'm going to get a little bit into what that looks like on the brain. So to start, we can think about it in terms of its short-term effects and its long-term effects. So short-term, alcohol is a depressant. This means that it slows down all the body systems, kind of quiet things down. And then this can lead to memory impairment, a disrupted judgment, and slower reaction time. And then in terms of the long-term effects, alcohol use over time can lead to brain shrinkage, and this can affect things like memory and reasoning. We also see brain damage over time. This can lead to more memory and decision-making issues, as well as impulse control issues. And then we see brain structure alterations overall. And this is what Colin was getting at earlier about the element of addiction. where we have those happy neurotransmitters that are released each time you maybe drink alcohol or use nicotine. And it's going to make you feel good, as Colin mentioned. It makes you want to go back to that over and over again. And that kind of gets you in a loop where you're seeking that out over and over again. And then in terms of physical effects, alcohol use over time can lead to heart disease and cancer. So there's three ways that we can kind of think about how alcohol long-term can affect mental health. So first, at the brain level. So alcohol use basically reduces the number of neurotransmitters available in the brain, specifically those happy hormones that we have been talking about, which are serotonin and dopamine. And this is important because we need a certain level of these neurotransmitters at all times to kind of ward off things like anxiety, depression. So with constant alcohol and continued alcohol use, we're going to see things like mood swings and higher levels of depression, anxiety, because there's this imbalance in neurotransmitters. And then at the social level, because of the immediate effects of alcohol, that impaired judgment, that impulse control, people end up doing things that they might regret later. And this can then hurt their relationships, especially if they're doing things that they regret over and over again, and also make them have poor decisions. For example, leading them to have financial issues because they're choosing to spend money on alcohol rather than other resources that they could use to better their life moving forward. And then this can lead to just unemployment overall, where we have these poor decision making, we have this poor impulse control, and this alcohol dependency leading to issues like unemployment. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, since we're seeing these long-term physical effects like cancer or heart disease, this is now a double burden where someone is dealing with alcohol addiction, and now they have the stress of dealing with their physical health conditions. And then finally, it's important to note that this is kind of a two-way stream, as in alcohol can affect mental health, like I just was talking about, but then people also use alcohol to manage their poor mental health. And this is kind of a vicious cycle where people are turning to alcohol to manage their mental health, but then in turn making their mental health worse. So yeah, that's kind of what's going on with alcohol in the brain and in mental health.
Oh, thank you so much for such an informative part of it. It was so very much informative. We have heard that we as adolescents specifically, I think these are people from 12 years or 13 years to 24. Correct me if I'm wrong. Somewhere
Mhm.
there. These are adolescents. And then we have heard that when you are an adolescent, your brain is not fully developed. So you taking in nicotine, taking in alcohol is not good for your health because it's still in the process of developing. So while it's in that process, you are also damaging it. So it's not really good. Well, I have heard that stress affects our mental health in ways that we do not necessarily expect. So, what are some major causes of stress in life, and how does stress affect the body?
Yeah. So again, stress happens throughout life. No matter what, like you are going to experience stress. We're going to talk a little bit more about just what stress is and then chronic stress, which is just stress over a long, long period of time. And what are some causes of stress, right? This could be economically, not having enough money to pay for things that you really need or your family needs. That's going to cause a lot of stress in somebody. Um, Political crisis, maybe there might be something happening and that's causing a lot of stress for somebody. Can also be social media can cause stress, right? Especially when we're thinking of adolescents. They can see things on social media that can give them stress. They can maybe somebody does something mean to them on social media that causes stress, or they're looking on social media and comparing themselves to another person and thinking, wow, I'm just not doing that, or I'm not there in my life. And then that causes stress. Or maybe you can be in an unsafe environment. That can also cause stress. If you're not feeling physically safe, then your body is going to be stressed. And then anything, even if a traumatic event in the past, it could be 10 years ago, can also cause stress for you, right? So what is happening when you're feeling stressed? And then what are some ways to combat that stress? So when you are stressed, as we've talked about already, you're triggering your flight or fight response in your body, basically, which is your body becomes super aware and super prepared to deal with whatever is causing you stress. So again, if you see a lion or if you see a car coming and you're in the road, your body is going to tense up and get ready to move. And that happens because your body releases three different things mainly. Cortisol, which is what we talked about a lot. Again, this is the stress hormone. It will also release epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, which I think a lot of people might have heard about before, and then norepinephrine as well. So these are the three main things that are going to get released when you're feeling stress. And this causes your heart rate to increase. It causes your blood pressure to rise. It causes your muscles to become tense and ready to go. It also, when cortisol release is released, your body's like knows that it needs energy to be able to move or to be able to act to whatever stressor is. So it needs glucose slash sugar. It needs something to be able to energize the body. So when cortisol is released, it also metabolizes or breaks down fats and carbs to give your body an instant source of energy. So again, we can have stress from a car coming and then moving out of the way, and that's okay. That's a normal thing. It's good that our body feels stress when a car is coming, so we know to move out of the way. But we're going to talk more about chronic stress and how that can really be detrimental and hurt somebody over time. So if you're feeling these increased heart rate, if you're having higher blood pressure, if cortisol is affecting, the glucose being released throughout the body over a long, long period of time, then it can have a lot of negative effects. Mainly can lead to hypertension, which is high blood pressure, basically. This is kind of known as a silent killer because people don't typically know that they have high blood pressure. And when you have high blood pressure, that can lead to heart attacks, stroke, different things like that because the blood is basically just, pumping so hard on the walls. And people might not know that. You can also get headaches from a lot of hypertension as well and chronic stress. And as we already said, cortisol affects the sugars being released in your body, so you can get rapid weight gain as well as if you have chronic stress, then maybe your cortisol is affecting your glucose levels. And also, if you're feeling stressed, we've talked about dopamine a lot. If you're feeling stressed, you want to feel better. So you might do something that gives you a quick release of dopamine. Eating food can give you a quick release of dopamine. So you might gain more weight when you're chronically stressed because you want that constant source of dopamine being released. You might also lose a lot of weight when you're stressed because you're forgetting to eat because your mind's focused elsewhere. Chronic stress can also really play a role in sleep, and sleep is so important for human beings. Like it is so incredibly important. And as we said, when you're stressed, your body releases cortisol. Cortisol is more than just a stress hormone. It also regulates our circadian rhythm, which is basically the our sleep cycle. So before you wake up, there's a spike in cortisol naturally. Right before you wake up, there's a spike in cortisol to wake your body up. And then it might go down later in the morning, and then it might spike a little bit in the afternoon to keep your body awake. But when you're chronically, and then at the end, when you're getting ready to go to sleep and bedtime, your cortisol might go down so your body can go to sleep. But when you're chronically stressed and if your hormone or if your cortisol levels are fluctuating, then it can really affect your sleep a lot as well, which is really detrimental to your brain because your brain needs sleep to repair any damages. And then also, again, as we said earlier, with if you're chronically stressed, it can play a role if you're also feeling depression because it can then negatively affect the amount of serotonin and dopamine again in your brain. So again, all of these things are linked. But it's just important to note that yes, stress from one thing when you're in danger is good, but chronic stress just has so many detrimental effects on your body. So it's important to think about ways to combat this. One, if you're feeling really, 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 really stressed right now, you can do a simple breathing exercise where you breathe in for 5 seconds, hold your breath for 5 seconds, and then breathe out for 5 seconds. That will control your heart rate. And then from there, it will help make you feel less stressed. It's also important to, you might want to go for a walk or go for a run. Simply going for a walk when you're feeling stressed can do a great thing because it can release endorphins in your body, which are kind of like your body's painkillers, as we talked about. So doing something like going for a walk can make you feel less stressed. Going to church might make you feel less stressed, or simply laughing. Being around people laughing, when you're laughing, endorphins are being released, and that can make you feel less stressed. But the most important thing when we're thinking about combating stress is identifying what is stressing you and either talking about that with somebody, or maybe if you can solve the issue, you can't always solve the issue, but talking about it with somebody is helpful. And then understanding things that can help you, make you feel good, release those endorphins. Going for a walk can also help, even if you can't solve the actual stressor itself.
So, what are some simple tricks to combat stress?
So in addition to the ones that Colin mentioned, I think we could talk about other ways of moving your body. Something that I see everyone doing here is dancing. It's another great way to release endorphins, get that happy feeling going. Also, dancing with your friends is awesome because you're connecting socially with them and then moving your body. So, great combination. And then some other things that I like to do to combat stress is doing things like journaling. And this kind of helps with what Colin was mentioning about the importance of identifying your stress, because when you start journaling, you're able to think about what is going on in my brain, what are things that are really standing out, and you can kind of put those thoughts on paper and kind of separate yourself from that stress. And then a third thing that I think is really simple that everyone can do is do things like listen to music. Sometimes everything that's going on in your brain, you just need a little break, and listening to music can get you out of your head, get you more in your body, and just feeling good overall, and just not focusing too much on the stress. Because when you're really focusing on the stress, that can lead to things like anxiety and just other kind of persistent things about, obsessing over what is making you stressed out, when sometimes the solution is to just try to think about something else.
So, considering the profound role it has claimed in the lives of our learners today, how does social media fit in the discussion at hand?
Yeah, I can start us off there. So I feel like social media is the issue of our 21st century. We see everyone down from little, 5, 6, 7 year olds up to the oldest people. Everyone is on some sort of social media or other. We have WhatsApp, we have Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. Everyone is just entrenched in the social media world. So I think it is definitely important, like you brought up, to talk about what's going on with social media, how is this affecting us, our mental health. And I think a good way to kind of start this discussion is talking about what's going on in the brain. So basically what happens with social media mirrors what we've talked about before. Basically, that same addiction that we look at with things like alcohol and nicotine is what goes on in the brain with social media. Basically, every time you use social media, the brain releases dopamine. That's that happy hormone that reinforces the behavior. So it makes people want to keep going back to their social media because they want to keep getting that little hit of dopamine. And then I think this is something we touched on earlier, where when you're not using social media or the thing that's giving you that dopamine, then you have experienced a dopamine crash. And this means that people might feel sad, anxious, or depressed when you're not using the social media. So then once again, you start turning to social media as if that's the solution, the thing that's gonna make you feel good, make you feel happy. But what we're seeing over time in this kind of consumption and social media use is an impact on brain. And this is especially true for adolescents. As we've mentioned over and over again, adolescents, their brain is still developing. And this means that excessive social media use can impact the development specifically of the prefrontal cortex. And if you can recall what we were talking about earlier, the prefrontal cortex is what's responsible for decision making and impulse control. So with effects on this part of the brain, you're going to see poor decisions later on and poor mental health overall. And then next, we're seeing a lot of issues with attention span because social media is set up to be so instant. You scroll through and you have videos like TikTok that are just a couple seconds long. You have all these notifications popping up on your phone that are grabbing your attention. And then often people even switch between different platforms as they're using social media. So they'll be on TikTok for maybe an hour and then they get bored. So they move to another app. They move to maybe WhatsApp or Facebook. And what research is showing is that this kind of use of you're getting quick content and you're getting a lot of it, this is going to affect attention span and focus. And this is especially important when we think about learners because it is going to affect things like their school performance because they're used to that sort of quick nature and now they're not able to sit and focus in their classes or focus on reading or doing their assignments. And then this is also something that we mentioned a little bit earlier in terms of stress. So social media can have a profound social impact, as in people, especially young people, are constantly seeing other people's lives on social media. And social media just gives you a fraction of their actual life and presents that person in their best light. So then this can lead to youth or just anyone in general feeling inadequate and just hurting their self-esteem because they're comparing themselves to what they're seeing online of someone else. Especially true if people are looking at celebrities or these kind of, influencers online. And then this can lead to things like a poor body image. So overall, we're just seeing these effects at the brain level, at the social level, and then just in general in the person's overall mental well-being because of social media.
All right. Now that we have a better understanding of mental health and the factors contributing to the poor mental health, what are the factors that our learners can take today, tomorrow, and beyond to pursue a positive well-being?
Yeah, so I think I'll start for a little bit and then Michaela can say hers as well. I think what you said at the very end about today, tomorrow, and beyond is really, really important. I think a lot of times, sometimes people can think that, wow, I'll feel better when I get to this point in my life. Once I achieve this, then I'll feel better. I'll have less anxiety. I might, be less depressed once I finally get here. But I think it's important to understand that really trying to tackle these challenge in the moment will help you achieve your goals in the long run. So what are small things that we can do every single day to try to work towards feeling, cultivating our mental well-being? And one thing I like to really think about is daily, can we try to release endorphins every single day? And again, these are kind of like the painkillers in the body. And as we said, going for a walk, listening to happy music, laughing, dancing, anything like talking to a friend can really help with that. And that's just going to make, if you can do that little thing every single day, or if you're feeling really, really stressed right now and you just need to go take a 5-minute walk down the road and then come back and your head might feel a lot more clear, then that can be really, really helpful. And then overall, I really just encourage people to talk about it with somebody, find somebody that they really trust, and then, get it off their chest, whatever that may be, is really, really beneficial.
Yeah, to just take off what Colin was saying, I cannot overemphasize as Colin was saying that cultivating a good mental health means you're doing it every day. It's not like you can put in the work and then be like, okay, I'm fine for next week, or I'm fine, for the next year because I did these things. It means that every day you're focusing on what can you do for your mental well-being? What are the things that you can do in the morning, in the evening, just at all times that are just going to make you feel good overall. So something that I like to compare it to give you some imagery, think of your mental health as a garden. You're not going to plant those seeds and then walk away and never tend to it. You want to, constantly be cultivating and giving it water, doing all the things, you're tending to it. And you want to do that for your mental health so that you can create a mental health that is positive, that is resilient, that it's able to deal with things like, that stormy weather that comes in, as we were talking about earlier. And just maybe some different examples that maybe we haven't touched on. I think, or maybe we have touched on most of these, but one is just kind of trying to cultivate a positive mindset overall. So sometimes you might think this is a little silly, but there's so much power in giving yourself affirmations. So, especially if you're dealing with negative thoughts, if you're dealing with kind of this talk in your head that is making you not feel good, actually being able to like say to yourself in your head that like you are good, you are strong, you are powerful, those sort of things, it's going to change how you think about yourself over time. And it's something that you just got to keep doing and just dealing with those negative emotions and thoughts as they come about. And then this is something that I mentioned earlier, but there's so much importance in naming your feelings. So a lot of the time, what's going on in your head can feel like this kind of tight, tangled ball of what's this happiness, sadness, stress, what's going on. So one thing you can do, as I mentioned, is journaling. Another is talking it out to try to just name what exactly are you feeling at the moment, because then that kind of disentangle what's going on, and then make you understand what you can then do moving forward. Because now you know, okay, I'm feeling stressed about this one thing, or maybe I'm feeling sad about this relationship. So it kind of gives you the tools to then know what you need to do for yourself. And then just some things overall, as we mentioned, social connection is so great. This could mean joining social groups at school. So you could join a club. You might want to create a stronger role in your church. Reaching out to the friends that you maybe haven't talked to in a while, all those sort of things that you probably know that is good for you that you actually have to put in the work to do, I think is important to talk about. And yeah, I think that's kind of everything that I was thinking is important.
All right, thank you. And that marks the end of our episode. Thank you all for being here. So let's remember that in this episode, we also talked about the central nervous system at large and all the neurons that are involved and all the brain structures. So we have also touched on depression and sadness, the differences between the two. So you should differentiate. By now, I'm fully aware that you can differentiate between sadness and depression. We also touched on anxiety, how we learners or we who are still in school or everybody else out there, how they go through anxiety. For instance, maybe you are having a test that is coming up, and how are you going to manage your anxiety? We talked on managing anxiety and depression as well. So we also talked on the effects of nicotine and alcohol in our lives. For we are adolescents, and we should keep in mind that our brain is not fully developed, and we are going through development as we grow until when you're 25. That is when your brain stops the developing part. So thank you for being a good audience, and a very big thanks to Michaela and Colleen for having us, for having you here, and thank you for your time. For our viewers, would like you to subscribe to our channel, like, share, and comment. Until we meet again, see you next time. Stay empowered and stay positive. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.